Well, hello there, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our on-demand video for Dynamics GP year-end closing, proudly brought to you by Interdyne Artists, a national leader in service and support for ERP solutions through the Dynamics platform. Your vision is our mission. We provide service and support for all things Dynamics. That's Dynamics 365, Navision or NAV, Dynamics GP, anything Power Platform related. That's Power BI, Power Apps, or Microsoft Flow. If you're looking for a partner who's on the cutting edge and is prepared to help service and support anything you need with your ERP solution, give us a call. That is interdyneartist.com. My name is Sean Dorward. I'm the GP practice lead here at Interdyne Artists, headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. We service and support customers all over the country and even internationally. You can find me on Twitter. I'm a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of ERP experience. I'm also a GPUG All-Star, which is user nominated and user voted, and I'm quite proud of that accolade. I'm Excel certified as an expert. I speak nationally at events for Business Central, Dynamics 365 at Directions NA. I speak at the Power BI World Tour, at the user groups, through Dynamic Communities. I also speak at SQL Saturdays, and we have for our customers an annual 2-day training event held right here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I also am a speaker there as well. Feel free to check out my podcast that I do with two of my friends, Mark Polino and Belinda Allen, at mbspodcast.com. I also have a personal blog site that I work on, and I share some life hacks. I call them life hacks. Those are things to help you be more efficient and more productive throughout your day. That's at gplifehacks.com. And again, our corporate website is interdyneartist.com. As I mentioned just a moment ago, our Vision event is our annual customer event. This is a 2-day training, which is content-packed with things from Business Central, Microsoft Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, Dynamics GP, and all sorts of things surrounding emerging technologies. This is over 40 sessions in 2 days held right here in Charlotte. We have a early bird pricing available. You could save up to $50. Again, that's interdyneartist.com/vision. Today, we're going to be talking about the Dynamics GP year-end process. This process is done in some modules by a calendar basis and or a fiscal basis. I put a little cheat sheet here. This is what we're going to be talking about as we go through our time together today. Very important. Something to take into consideration through your year-end process is the year-end software update. Every year, Microsoft releases an update to the software. It's a simple patch that gets applied, and it does things like updates for 1099 law changes or things relating to the Affordable Care Act, or maybe there's some depreciation changes. This isn't just for payroll, although folks who use payroll and GP, this is a hard, fast requirement every year, but if you're not using payroll, this is something you should consider as well. It is a roll-up with any new features that were released in the R2 version. For example, GP 2018 R2 was released not too long ago, so you would get those features as well, any bug fixes, and naturally those law changes that Microsoft has included in both the software and the code. This is supported through from GP 2015 through the current version GP 2018 R2. I put a link to the blog here. We'll be sure to put that down in the description as well. The year-end software update this year is no W-2 or W-4 changes. There's some minor changes for 1099, so keep that in mind as you decide whether or not you're going to apply this. If you don't apply it, you're not going to have that current 1099 information, and naturally some ACA things along the way. This is available now and can be downloaded directly from customer source, or reach out to us. We'll be glad to help you get this taken care of. Just some precautions as you go through the year-end process. I can't say this enough. Backup should be done every time, even if you feel like you've done this before and you've never used them. please go through that diligent step, get a backup before and after each module's closing, separate them. You can always delete them later if you don't need them, but better to be safe than sorry. One other thing you might want to consider doing is creating a test company from your main company. That's a simple process as well. You can go ahead and do that or reach out to us for help. Get yourself an updated test company and run through this process. Take some notes, maybe develop your own year-end closing checklist specific for your organization. Also need to make sure that users are out of the system. Some modules don't say that, some do, but hey, it's just safer that way. We want to make sure that this goes as smoothly as possible, right? And also make sure you take into account any third-party software that you have installed in your environment. They may have separate closing steps for those ISVs as well. And the order is important, at least for the most part. Some things can be shifted around. That's not a problem, but certainly you want to make sure that you get things done in an efficient order. For example, you wouldn't want to close payables and then post payables batches for the year after you close. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in and get started closing the sales module. So who should run this closing for this module? Well, if you use the Smart List objects for sales and receivables, that is the year-to-date or life-to-date buckets. You definitely want to make sure you run this. If you use the receivables management summary reports, also want to run this. And if you use the customer summary window, this module is technically optional to close. If you don't close this module, it's not going to interfere with anything, but all of those year-to-date or life-to-date balances do not get updated. And what I mean by those buckets, if I go into the customer yearly summary window, you'll see that I have a drop down here for amount since last close, fiscal year and calendar year. If I never run the sales close process, everything will show in my amount since last close, and nothing will get moved to last year. To help articulate that a little more, if I jump to a smart list for my customers, I've got two columns here, year-to-date and last year. This year-to-date, if I don't close, the sales module just means since my last close. It's designed to be year-to-date, I suppose, but it really means since last close. And the last year will not get updated, so this last year bucket doesn't get updated if I don't run the close process. You want to be sure to run this on a consistent day because it updates those year-to-date and life-to-date buckets. If you run this on January 10th one year or January 3rd another year, there's really no consistency behind what really is year-to-date or last year if you use those buckets. I tend to prefer to use date parameters from the documents to build my last year smart list, but if you use those buckets, you want to make sure you use consistent dates. As I mentioned, the closing is optional. There's a couple reports that are going to come with this. You're going to get a closing report. You have the option to close the fiscal year or the calendar year, or you could do both at the same time. And what it does is it updates, as I mentioned, those buckets for finance charges. It updates all of the sales information from those buckets from year to date to last year and updating the life to date. So it also updates the salesperson and territory information. Before we jump in and actually go through the closing, I have a couple slides here. Again, this is just reminding you that under the yearly summary, that's the bucket that gets updated. I want to also point out that before you run your year-end closing for general ledger, this doesn't necessarily need to be done for closing the sales module. In fact, it does not need to be done for closing the sales module. It's probably a good idea to use a new feature. I think it came out in GP 2013. I still call it new because not everyone is aware of this. It's the reconcile to GL functionality. Basically what this does, you find it under financial routines, reconcile to GL. You have 4 modules you can reconcile to. Receivables is one of them. You identify the account or accounts you want to reconcile against, and then it creates an Excel spreadsheet. That Excel spreadsheet on the left shows your subsidiary or your receivables transactions, and on the right showing your GL transactions. At the very bottom of that spreadsheet is a reconciliation. Notice here in that sort of tan banner, I've got unmatched transactions or potentially matched. And here in my case, all of my transactions are matched. But when you run this, you may see things in unmatched or potentially matched. Those are generally triggers to say, oh, maybe I didn't post a deposit, or maybe there's a batch that I didn't post to GL. So be sure to run the reconcile to GL. Also, before closing the year, now is a good time to do some customer maintenance. Under sales, utilities, customer, combiner, and modifier, you can take those customers that maybe you have 2 records for, but there really should only be 1, and you can combine them. Or if you found a customer that was not named correctly using your internal naming convention and you want to fix their name, you can do that. This tool, you have it, it's in the product. This tool updates all of the master record IDs, it retains all history, and it combines or modifies those IDs. So not a bad time to consider doing that. Also, a very good time to write off those sort of hanging Chad transactions where you have a little bit that was not collected. That's under sales routine write-off. You can set yourself a write-off limit and a cutoff date. So maybe you want to do it for transactions that are a year old or 6 months old. And you can do this by customers. What I love about this is it does it in bulk, but it does present a preview or a queue, if you will, so you can see what the system would write off. This does all the GL work for you, and it clears out those documents. So definitely a good time to do that. Also, if you have any refunds that you need to issue to customers, maybe you want to wait as long as you possibly can, but to clean up that general ledger and your customer accounts, using the sales transactions refund checks option, you can quickly and easily create a refund check for a customer for those overpayments or whatever created the balance for the customer. It automatically creates the debit memo. It automatically creates the select checks or select payments batch for you to pay against a temporary vendor. That temporary vendor is linked to the customer, and it automatically clears those transactions out for you and makes it easy to pay. So be sure to check that out as well. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and close my tax year, but if you track taxes in your system and you want to close it out, it's the same concept. This is capturing the year-to-date information. It's not a requirement. You want to do this when both the purchasing and the sales modules have been closed. Naturally, you want to do it after everything is posted for the year as well. That's under Administration, Routines, Company, Tax Year, and Close. I want to make sure that you are aware that if you close your tax year, to keep a backup, as I mentioned earlier, because that prior year tax information gets deleted. It just updates the totals. So if you need to get to the detail, we definitely recommend keeping a backup of your data. So in summary, I have a little bit of a high-level checklist here. Make sure you enter and post all your current sales transactions. That is a given. In order to effectively close the year, make sure the year transactions are posted. Complete your normal month and year-end closing process. If you have a monthly checklist for sales, run through that. Those are things like balancing or reconciling your AR, spot checking customer accounts, running finance charges, all those things. Definitely want to do that. The routine is found under sales, routine, year-end close. You close either the sales or the fiscal year or both, and make sure you do your pre and post backup. So let's go ahead and do that. And remember, in my sales here, I have total sales year to date and total sales last year. Nothing is in last year. So let's go to routines in the sales module and year-end close. Pretty simple window. I either close all or just the fiscal or the calendar. Notice I get some in just very little bit of detail about the last closing date, so you have an idea, okay, my system has not been closed before. If it was just closed yesterday, clearly somebody did this for me, so you want to investigate that. I'm just going to click continue. Yes, I want to continue, and then I'm going to get 3 reports. One is going to be my customer close, and this is my customer statements. Then I'm going to get my salesperson report, which is closing out those master records and moving the balances. And then lastly should be my territory report, and it's going to run through Just like that, I have closed the sales module. If I go back in the sales module, you'll see that it says the last time I closed. That's my system date in my demo company. Now if I refresh my smart list to show you the impact of closing, I'll refresh it and you'll see that those dollar amounts were moved from the year-to-date bucket to the last year bucket. Notice it did not matter what day I did this, the system just moved it. So when you run it, make sure the date you're running it is a meaningful date in your organization and that all your transactions are posted. Alrighty, so let's move on. Just a couple slides to the last one here, showing what steps you go through if you're going to close just the calendar or fiscal year. We're going to move on to the purchasing module. Very similar to the sales module. Same thing with those year-to-date buckets. In fact, if I jump into Smart List again, I'll show you an example for vendors. Very similar concept, year-to-date, last year, and life-to-date. So let's open up purchasing and then vendors. And here we go. So I should have two columns here, amount billed year-to-date and amount paid year-to-date. Notice that my last year is empty. Very same concept. Again, optional if those buckets aren't important to you. Totally disconnected from the 1099 process. We'll get into that a little bit more. If you use the payables management summary reports or the vendor yearly summary window, that's definitely a good idea to run this close process as well. So let's look at the vendor yearly. And very similar to the sales yearly, we have the amount since last close. So hopefully that gives you an idea on what gets impacted. Again, disconnected from 1099s. No need to run this in order to generate your 1099s. Only if you find value in those buckets. Again, the date is important. Make sure you're consistent in the date across modules, or excuse me, across years. You want to run this at the same time after all your transactions have been posted. A key here is before your new year transactions have been posted, because the system is not going to know what is for the new year and what is for the last year. It basically just says all the transactions since the last close. You're going to get the calendar and fiscal year option here again, where you can do both. Again, just a slide for the example for the yearly updates. Again, though, take into consideration running the reconcile to GL. This was good for sales. It's also good for payables. It's found under financial. You don't need to close the payables module in order to do this, and it's not needed to close the payables module, but you definitely want to reconcile your AP accounts before closing your financial general ledger, and this tool can help you get along the way a bit easier. Just like the customers, definitely a good time to consider modifying or combining vendors. If you've got 2, 3, 4 different vendors, but they're really all the same, do this before you run your 1099s. It's going to make 1099 process a bit cleaner for you as well. I mentioned a minute ago, 1099s are not connected to the closing process for the purchasing module. If you've been told that, that's not quite true. In fact, it's just not true. You do not need to close the purchasing module in order to run 1099s. 1099 buckets are populated by payment date. You want to take into consideration that year-end software update I mentioned in the beginning of our video. There may be some changes in there that need to be applied before you run your 1099. I have a link here. We'll put it in the description for a 1099 SQL view that you can drop into Smart List. This gives you all of the buckets that you need, that you want to evaluate, in a linear list that you can easily export to Excel. If you've ever seen the purchasing 1099, let's see where we at here. There we are. If you've ever seen the 1099 edit list in GP, you'll see it's not the easiest to audit. It basically gives you a vendor or two per page. It's not the easiest to audit. It basically gives you just some high-level information. It doesn't show you what bucket they're checked for. It just shows the amount for 1099. Now, if we go back to our slide deck here, this link here takes you out to my blog, where there's a SQL view that you can easily put into Smart List. And so I have a Smart List called 1099 Audit. And here's a list of my vendors, their types, the year, so I can search, put the appropriate year on here and only see those years. That's a pretty helpful tool for 1099s. Check that out. If you're modifying 1099s, there's a couple different options. So you go through the year, you forgot to set a vendor as 1099, or you realize after you've posted several transactions. There's a tool that can take and make those fixes for you. Purchasing utilities, update 1099 information. This can update the vendor it can change it from an existing. So if maybe I set it as dividend, but it should have been miscellaneous, I can fix it, or vice versa in my screenshot there. It could also update the transactions as well. So if you've posted 10 transactions and they were flagged for the wrong 1099 type, you can make those changes here. Those are for already posted transactions. You can also edit transaction details. So under purchasing transactions, edit 1099 transaction. This is an actual screenshot of what that looks like. You see, these are editable fields, so that 1099 amount, I can make changes if there was only 50% of it should have been applied to 1099s. Or if some transactions were set with the wrong tax type, I can just quickly go ahead and make those changes in this window. And then next one is just if we don't want to change the actual transactions, is at the year end, we have a small modification to make, and we just want to update the buckets of data that are used for 1099. That's under purchasing cards and 1099 details. In this window, we pick the appropriate month, the year, and the amount field is editable, so we can just change that, in my example, 1466.46 to maybe 1450 or something, or whatever the correct amount is. This is helpful for after the fact. You issue them, a vendor contacts you, there was a return that didn't get handled properly or something like that. You could certainly check that out. And then the last step for 1099s is printing them. This is under routines, purchasing routines, 1099. Take note, there are two print buttons there. One is the edit list that I showed you a few minutes ago, and the other is the print forms. And down in the bottom left, you have the 1099 form or the 1096. These forms you do have to have the pre-printed forms for. So you may want to use that alignment option to make sure. Also in the purchasing module, if you do use Encumbrance Manager, you can carry over the remaining budget amounts to the new fiscal year. That's under Purchasing Routines, Year-end Encumbrance Transfer. Here in this light illustration, we have a remaining balance in 1 year, and it's going to basically move it from 1 year to the other for you. That's the year encumbrance transfer. If you use encumbrance management and you want to carry those balances forward. Lastly is the actual routine of closing the year. Very similar to sales. This is under purchasing routines, year-end close. We get the fiscal and calendar option, and we would just mark close year. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go into purchasing routines, year-end close, and I'm going to close both. Again, if I closed it before, it would show here. Unlike sales had a process button in the top left. Here we just choose close year, and we're going to get our vendor updates here. Again, before running this, I would make sure several things. I'd make sure I'd have a backup. I would make sure that all of my transactions were posted. That's one of the reasons why closing sales and purchasing is air quote optional, because if we need to close it at 12/31 to truly capture the year-to-date details, we know we never get all the payables invoices in before 12/31. They come in the mail by maybe even mid-January. But nonetheless, if you wanted to close the payables module, you could certainly do that. Again, disconnected from the 1099 process altogether. So we get our vendor report. Now if I look at my smart list, I'll refresh that. You'll see that my balances have been moved from the year-to-date over to the last year buckets. And that essentially is what's happening with the payables year-end close. A walkthrough step checklist here if you're closing calendar or fiscal, and the order of which you should do things, with the exception of 1099s. 1099s, I just put it in there as if it were to be one complete process, but remember, they can be done outside of this process. Even if you don't close purchasing, your 1099s are still going to be right, or as right as they were entered, I should say. Moving on to inventory. If you use inventory module and you want the annual quantities, or if you use the annual quantity summary, whether that's in a card or history windows, when this should be run, same thing. This should be run with your fiscal closing. This isn't a year. This isn't a year-end calendar if your fiscal is not in sync with the calendar. Definitely make sure all your transactions have been posted. That includes things from sales and purchasing because they might affect your inventory and any adjustments. You may want to consider a year-end stock count and take care of entering those adjustments as well. What this does is it updates the yearly quantity summaries. It zeroes out the beginning year amounts and it updates beginning year quantities. You have a couple options through the close process. We'll get to those in a bit more detail as we walk through it. Before you start, again, make sure you post those transactions. I put a list here of some inventory reports that might be helpful for you to run before you run this. Again, I kind of defer back to my first precaution, which is try this in a test environment because you want to make sure that, inventory can be tricky. So we want to make sure that we're as ready as we can be before we close this. And you may want to do a physical count, as I mentioned, and print these reports. So when you close the inventory module, you get three options. Again, backing up, inventory routines, year-end close. But you get three options, actually four. First one is discontinued items. So mark this option to remove records for discontinued items that have been completely sold. That's straight from the help. This is pretty cut and dry. If you want them removed, check that box. The same is true for sold lot attributes. If you had things like expiration dates being tracked and you want to remove those attributes, you can remove them. And sold receipts, those are the records that have been received and then sold. You can remove these and you can by setting a date as well. So have a cutoff date. Maybe you'd use it at the beginning of the year because you want to keep a year available. And then updating the item's standard cost. So if you're using FIFO or LIFO and you want to update the standard costs, go ahead and check this box. Again, deferring to your test company would be a best practice recommendation for closing the inventory module. There's a lot that happens when you close the inventory module. I put a nice list of them here. You can pause the video and take a look at this. Again, keep these in mind as you go back and look at your test environment to make sure the results are the expected and desired results for your organization. A checklist for the closing the inventory module. Again, not a calendar year closing. You want to do this in test first, purely fiscal year, and be sure to close the inventory module in your fiscal periods. So let's go ahead and do that real quick in our inventory module. I'm not going to check any of my options. I'm just going to do year-end close. It'd probably take a little bit of time if I decided to. And this is going to run through each of my inventory items, update the quantities, and then we'll be all set. Very good. Not too bad in my little demo environment. Allow yourself some time. Real important that everything is posted and that users are out of the system. So we're going to move on to the payroll module. I noted on here on the right-hand side that the year-end software update is available soon. It actually was released just today, so that is available. I have a link in the description for you. If you use the payroll module or you just simply track employee details for ACA reporting, you definitely want to close the payroll module. You want to close the payroll module after your last payroll of the calendar year has been processed and posted, but, and very important, but before you run the first payroll of the calendar year. I get asked this a lot. Do I need to install the year-end update if I use payroll? Yes. Is it required if you don't use payroll? It depends. It depends on what is being provided in the update and what parts of the system you use. But if you use payroll, yes. Installing the year-end software update is not anchored to timing. So we want to close the module after our last payroll, but before our first payroll. But we can install the year-end update today, for example, well in advance to kind of take off some of that pressure that we have at year-end in between that last payroll and the first payroll of the new year. So if you've heard that the year-end software has to be applied after the last payroll but before the new payroll. That is not correct. It can be applied anytime. But what about those tax table changes? Microsoft also provides the New Year tax rates. Those are the important things that you want to wait to not apply until right before you run your first payroll of the new year. So there are two components here. There's a software update, which can be installed at any time, and the tax rate update for the new year. That needs to be installed after your last payroll, or after you close the module is the best way to say it. After we close and issue your W-2s. Anything you do after you apply the new tax rates for the new year, the system's going to use those rates. It doesn't have two sets of rates, so if we needed to rerun a W-2 after putting in the 2019 tax rates, it's not going to pull the information correctly. Closing the payroll module, we want to make sure everything's posted. We want to make sure that you run through all of your normal monthly, quarterly, and annual reporting, your 941, everything. Get everything buttoned up. Make sure you have your backups in place and that the software update has already been installed. It's a good tip to just verify that your 2018 tax rates are in place. I've seen some instances where organizations have applied the software update, but IT may have not been aware of the fact that the tax update was something that they had to wait for. So just verify that your 2018 tax rates are in place. You want to create your year-end wage file, and we'll do a backup after that as well. We're going to talk about how to edit W-2 information. I have some tips on that as well. And then as all the way at the bottom of the list, the bottom right, apply the tax table update. That is after you've completely closed out and ready to run the new year. If you are interested in a free ACA add-on tool, it's not available online anywhere that I'm aware of. You just have to email my buddy Tom Friends at Integrity Data. And if you're on, I think it's 15, 16, or 18, this little add-in, it's available. You drop it in, and it's available from your additional drop-down on your employee maintenance window. Surfaces the ACA codes where you can quickly and easily make those changes. Makes it a whole lot easier. I want to make sure that you're aware that you don't have to wait till the end of the year to run your year-end wage file to do spot checks and audits. The year-end wage file can be run over and over and over again. It doesn't matter how many times you run it a year. The important part is that you run it one final time after your last payroll. Every time you run the year-end wage file, if it's for a year that has a wage file that already exists, the system will say, there's already a year-end wage file for this. Do you want to delete them? It doesn't delete anything on the employee record. It just deletes that roll-up or those buckets of data that get used for the 1095s and W-2s. So it's definitely a good practice to run your wage file, maybe quarterly, audit the results, and make the appropriate changes in GP using the transaction window or maybe the manual check/adjustment window. If you edit the W-2s via the edit W-2 window, those changes will get overwritten every time you run the year-end wage file for the same year. So if I ran this halfway through the year and I needed to adjust Sean's Social Security withholding by $50, when I rerun it after my last payroll, that's going to get updated. So the real process is running the year-end wage file, looking at the results, making the changes through the system, not editing the W-2 window. Also, a link which we'll have in the description for a year-end wage review smart list. Right now, the year-end wage review report is pretty lengthy, but this gives you, just like I talked about for the 1099s, this gives you a smart list. It's a SQL view that you can build a smart list on and then audit your data that way. This makes it a whole lot easier. I think you'll like that if you put that in your system. The W-2s are found under HR Payroll Routines Print W-2s. Unlike the 1099s, W-2s do have a pre-printed or a graphical report, which is the form type one wide forms with box. So if you don't want to buy pre-printed W-2s, Dynamics GP from version 2016 R2 forward will include the boxes for you. Just like that. Looks pretty cool. And if you're curious, I wanted to share this with you as well, how to apply tax updates. I'm not going to put the step-by-step in here because quite honestly, this is year-end close, not year-end start. But if you want to know how to apply the year-end tax updates, there's a link which we'll put in the description for you. Closing payroll updates the W-2 buckets, uses the tax code on the system, so we want to make sure we verify that is correct. It can be done multiple times, as I've already explained. I think that's a really good technique to making year-end closing go a bit smoother for you. And remember that the W-2 and 1099-R changes, if you edit them in the edit window, then they're going to get replaced when you run it the final time. So the real answer is anything that you need to change, you change through the system through transactions or adjustments. So let's go ahead and do that. In my environment, I've posted on my payroll for the year, and this is a routine year-end closing. If I click on year-end wage report, just want to kind of take a sidestep here. If I click on year-end closing report, you see I already have one for 2027. That's how I know that I have a year-end wage report that exists. So I can click on this report, and this will run it to my screen. And you'll see that I get quite a few pages. You know, one employee takes up a lot of space, unlike that smart list that I showed you. So be sure to check that out. If I go and run my year-end closing, and I'm going to pick my demo year here and just hit process. It's going to ask us, do we want to apply the carryover for PTO year-to-date amounts? That's up to you depending on how you track. I'm just going to say continue. And this is going to run through, and it says, hey, year-end wage records already exist for the selected reporting period. Do you want to delete them? I'm going to delete them. That's what I was referring to moments ago. It's just the data in the bucket, and it doesn't delete transactions, so no worries there. And it's going to replace that information. So I'm going to create the new year-end wage file. It's going to look out at all my transactions, all my adjustments. If I've been doing my due diligence throughout the year, running my year-end wage report and posting the appropriate transactions through manual check adjustments or something of the sort, those changes will now get taken into account. So now if I go into edit W-2 and I make a change in here, if I were to make a change in here, I could, but really, again, you want to try to make a transaction to update these. If you make a transaction, you have to rerun your year-end wage file. And then the last part is printing our W-2s. So I'm going to print my W-2. I'm going to pick my W-2 forms wide width box, pick the appropriate year, and then print them. If I did just make changes to the W-2, edit W-2 window, those changes will get included when I run this. That's not a problem. And there's our window. There's our report. Just that easy. Now I've closed my payroll. And now it's time to run my new payroll, so I want to apply the tax updates before I do so. Here's a cheat sheet step by step on what you need to do. It may be slightly different for your organization depending on how things work internally, but this is a great start. Payroll is just calendar year, and there's no fiscal closing. So if your fiscal year is not in sync with your calendar year, there is no fiscal closing. Now, next up in our list, I have financial module. This is after everything in the system has been posted. Sales, inventory, you name it, everything has been posted. You want to make sure you have backups in place before you run this. What this does is it updates the P&L accounts to your retained earnings accounts. It updates your balance sheet accounts, bringing those balances forward. The open year data is moved to the history year buckets. Analytical accounting balances are processed as well. So be sure to, I have a couple links in here to talk about AA closing and what you should be aware of if you're an analytical accounting user. You want to make sure that before you run this, that you print an account list or look at a smart list and verify the account types. This is really important. What I mean by that is if I look at my financial account And where's it at here? If I look at my financial account, the setup here is the posting type, kind of in the middle left of the window. This determines what happens. If it's, the system does not care what your account number is. So your account number might be correctly numbered as a balance sheet. But if this is accidentally set as a profit and loss account, the balance in this account will get closed to your retained earnings. So really important to make sure that everything is set correctly. An easy way to do that, I'm going to leave it set as P&L just for now so I can show you. An easy way to do that is using a smart list. So I'll come into smart list, and most organizations have their chart of accounts structured in a way that the balance sheet accounts are together in their number range and the P&L accounts are together as well. So we can use that to our advantage. So I'm going to go to financial and accounts, and I'm just going to pull up a list of accounts. So you see I've got my account number and posting type. So maybe what I really want to say is I'm going to add this column, and I'm going to add my main account segment to it. So maybe what I want to say is, okay, tell me all of the accounts where my main account segment is less than 4,000 in my case, but the posting type is equal to P&L. So this is saying, hey, everything in my organization up to 3,999 should be a balance sheet account. I want to see when they're not set as balance sheet. I want to see when they're set as P&L. So this is an exception smart list. Now what I can do is save this. You see there's that one that I switched, and it says, hey, this one is not set correctly. And I could do the same for the opposite for my P&L accounts. All I have to do is double click on this, make the appropriate change. In my case, I got a simple password in there, and then refresh my smart list. And now I know for my balance sheet accounts, I'm good to go. That's a simple process, but a super, super important process, because if you accidentally close out a balance sheet account as a P&L, there's work you need to do to rectify that issue. And we'll talk about that as well. Make sure your general ledger setup is correct. We'll talk about that. Print some reports. Make sure you have something to look at to verify that everything went smoothly. And don't forget your backups. Unit account balances, depending on the version you're on, you may need to run a script in order to get those balances cleared out. There's not a separate analytical accounting closing, but there are things to take into consideration. I have a link here on a knowledge base article that is a very good one that you should take and read if you're an AA user. Want to be sure to share that. We'll have that down in the description. Here's that script I was talking about. Depending on your version, unit accounts close out like balance sheet accounts, which means the balance is brought forward. If you want to treat them as P&L accounts and have them clear out at the end of the year, a little script can do that for you. Now, in newer versions, there's options that control that for you. Should I wait till my audit is over to close my year? Absolutely not. This process can be done, and it likely should be done as early as possible after everything is posted and the timing is right. So we're talking like mid-July on a calendar year fiscal, mid-January on a calendar year fiscal. And the reason for that is because we have this option under Financial Setup General Ledger to allow posting to history. That is specifically for things like audit entries, and it automatically updates based on your settings, whether it's a P&L account or a balance sheet account. So should I wait to close my books until the audit is over? Definitely not. Make sure you check out that setting, Post to History under Financial Setup General Ledger. This option gives us the ability to post after the year is closed if you have access and the fiscal period is open in your company's setup. But it does automatically create those entries, either bringing the balance forward or closing out to retained earnings. So given that you have this option, I would recommend closing your year as soon as you can with your normal business process. There's that checkbox, allow posting to history. Your fiscal period must be open, and you can only post to the most recently closed fiscal year. So if you have to post to 2 fiscal years ago, you need to open that fiscal year, undo the close of that fiscal year, which is under the close routine. A financial life hack here for account postings. I already talked about this, showing you the smart list. Be sure to do this and set it up and save it. You can even monitor this monthly instead of waiting till year end. It's a nice little tip to keep your accounts clean and in the appropriate order and settings. Here's that link I promised about analytical accounting. It's a big breakdown on all things AA for year-end closing. We'll put that in the description. If you haven't closed your year and your management reporter reports aren't working, well, that's likely because that GP updates a field or a column called balance brought forward, and management reporter uses that as the beginning balance. If you don't close your year, the beginning balance won't work. So rather than modify your reports, there are workarounds, but rather than modifying your reports, just close the year. Remember, you can open it back up later on if you need to, or post audit entries to it. No worries there. So save yourself the time and trouble. Let's go ahead and take a look at what would happen if we've closed the year and an account type was set wrong. So an example would be that 2020 account earlier was still set as P&L and we didn't catch it. Really important. Don't move a muscle. Don't try to correct it through journal entry. Don't change it in the account maintenance window. Don't do anything once you realize this has happened. You just go into financial routines, financial year-end closing, and in there you're going to see an option for reverse historical year. You want to check that. That will undo the closing or reverse the closing of the previous year. When that reversal is done, then you want to make the changes to those accounts in the account maintenance window and then reclose your year. Very important order there. Be sure to follow that if this ever happens to you. Well, that brings us to actually closing the year. So we've gone through all of our modules. We've closed everything. We've posted everything. We've checked our batch recovery. Everything's good to go. When we get into the year-end close option, which is under financial routines, financial year-end closing, we have a few options in here. And we already talked about reversing the historic year, but let's take a look at some of the others. So you want to verify your retained earnings account is accurate. The journal entry auto-populates, no real reason to change that. And you want to verify your last closed year. So you know, in my environment that says 2024, I'm in 2027. I can't close 2027 until 2025 is closed. So that's why I don't have a choice on what year is going to close. It's just going to close the oldest open year first. And that obviously is for those balance brought forward fields. A couple options here. Remove unused segment numbers, the first one. If you want to do that, I would definitely recommend deferring back to trying that in your test environment to make sure you get the desired results or expected results. Maintain inactive accounts. In my opinion, this likely should be defaulted to checked, but if you don't check it, inactive accounts are going to get removed from your system. This can be a nightmare because you can inactivate them, balance is zero, but it might have had activity in January 2017, and so when you run your comparative financials or financial statement for that period, that information is no longer going to be there. The same is true for budgets. So you maintain inactive accounts. You can maintain inactive accounts that have just budget amounts, or you can maintain inactive accounts for all of them. I recommend maintain inactive accounts and all inactive accounts. There is no undo process for that, so be sure you have a backup. And the checklist, just like the other modules. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to run and close my year. Pretty easy. The system notices that I have some things out there. I'm in a demo environment. Please pay more attention to what's out there than I am right now, but I'm just going to show you this. One of the few places we get a status bar. We see we're on step 3 is 7. At the end of this process, we're going to get a printout of our journal entry that was used to close our year. And I'll bring that to the screen. So I get my journal entry closing my year 2024. And you see that's my retained earnings breakdown. Even handles the multi-currency for me. After I process that, My year updates to the next new year, my last close date, and I can reverse that if I wanted to. So one more thing before we run, and that is fixed assets. Now, I mentioned when we were closing financial that you should have everything posted in all the other modules. And this is something I actually learned at a GPUG meeting a couple of years back, and it's a super valuable tip. You know, the real thing is that fixed assets, now that we have the option to post to history, fixed assets doesn't need to be closed before your financial module. And in the real world, that's sometimes the case. You know, so if you want to close your financial books timely, as I recommended, you may have fixed asset changes that come into play. You may have depreciation law changes, or you're going to expense this, or you have an invoice that rolls in a little late and you need to capitalize it. This module can actually be closed after your financial, because we can use it in conjunction with the post to history option. If you use fixed assets, you definitely want to close this when the time is right. This draws the line in between last year's book and this year's book. It updates all the annual activity. You want to make sure everything is posted in your purchasing module, for example. All your transactions and all of your assets have been depreciated. All of your changes, your retirements, everything has to be done before you close these books in fixed asset. So the module itself doesn't necessarily get closed, but the books per year in the module get closed. A list of some suggested reports you may want to print off to a file just so you have a couple of those. A fixed asset life hack, a link to a blog, someone else's blog about this, a stored procedure that you can use in SSRS reports to get historic information by the book in from Dynamics GP. You can also find these reports, this is pretty new, in financial reports, fixed assets depreciation. You can actually run a depreciation ledger showing the depreciation as of a certain date. So if you were told you couldn't do that, depending on your version, you should be able to. Here's the screenshot, financial report, fixed assets depreciation, and just make sure you put in your depreciated as of date in that field. To close the fixed asset module, pretty simple. It's under routines in the fixed assets drop down and year end. In my environment, I've got 3 books, an AMT, federal, and internal. If I wanted to just close one, I could do so just by clicking it and moving it over to the right side and then choosing continue. You want to make sure that your fixed asset calendars are set up and your quarters are set up for the new year. Those are likely already out there, but you want to make sure, because you're going to need those for moving forward. Do your backup, due diligence, and run this routine. So let's jump into fixed assets and click on year end. And even though I'm just going to move all and then hit continue, confirm that I want to do so. Get a warning that some assets have been fully depreciated. I'm going to run my reports. I'll save these in a real world environment. I would be saving these off somewhere, printing them to a file. Here's my fixed asset report showing my year-to-date net book information. Pretty cool stuff. Pretty simple if you're aware of the order and some of the consequences. But also in this case, for fixed assets, if we have posting the history open, that would create a batch for us, and we could go out and post that after our financial module is closed. That does, in fact, bring us to the end of our Dynamics GP year-end on-demand video. I hope that was helpful. I will be sure to include those links down below. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. Don't forget our 2-day customer event. If you're not a customer of ours, we would love for you to be one. Please reach out to us and learn more about what our team does and how we can help your organization. That early bird, interdyneartist.com/vision. And last but absolutely not least, my 3 colleagues, Chelsea, Ashley, and Lisa, they're all waiting and hoping that you give them a call if you have questions about this video or anything we do here at Interdyne Artists. We look forward to hearing from you.